it's not that LLMs are magic. There's no I mean, they kind of seem like magic if you would go back 2 years ago in the field of AI, you would almost consider them magic because of how much of a leap they are, obviously. But indeed, there's a lot to be said about human preference. So a lot of the magic that makes LLMs like ChatGPT just work or do what we want is this process of reinforcement learning with human feedback, this process of tuning the model to give answers that we want to see. But it's very much biased towards the type of people that give that feedback, right?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the AI and Transformation podcast brought to you by GMSC Consulting. We are your hosts, Angelique and Gabriele. In this podcast, you will learn how you can integrate all sorts of AI and digital transformation solutions into your business. Our guest for today is Tim Leers, an R&D engineer for dataroots. In case you're new to the episode, you might also want to check out our previous episode with Tim's colleague, Virginie Marelli, in which we discussed churn prediction. Now, for today, with Tim, we will dive deeper into the world of LLM or large language models. So, welcome, Tim, to our podcast.
Thank you very much, Angelique. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So before we go into the technicalities of LLM, I think it would be nice if you could also tell our listeners more about yourself. So who is Tim Leers?
Still trying to figure that out as well. So as you mentioned, I am an R&D engineer at dataroots. I'm in a bit of a hybrid role where I'm an R&D and machine learning engineer, which means that in terms of functions, I do a lot of the things that a machine learning engineer would do, but my focus is a bit more on the R&D side of things. So projects that have a high degree of uncertainty or are strategically uncertain in different ways. So where there is a need for sensing, so trying to understand where the market is going, where a certain technology might be evolving in the future, and then advising our clients in that process. Another component that we sometimes see, especially for larger companies that also have their own R&D department, is that they're looking for a party that might be able to collaborate in a research process, including the process of writing a proposal for funding, for example. In practice, I currently work for a large media company where I also take a hybrid role. I'm both executing projects, so really writing the code to get things working, to get these AI systems doing what we want them to do sometimes. But I'm also advising decision makers, both at a company level and on a project level, about how they should navigate these crazy times with LLMs.
Yeah, that's often the life of machine learning engineers. Never just one thing. So why don't we dive into today's use case? What do you think, Angelique?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe, Tim, could you share us more about the use case? Because from what I recall, it's on broadcasting, so media. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah, it's a media and broadcasting company. So what does that mean? It's a company that creates media, distributes media, but is also a public broadcaster. So in a role of having to broadcast radio, television, etc.
And so for this use case, what's the AI behind the media coverage that you're working on, for this company?
Sure. So maybe a little bit of background. I work in the innovation department of this media company. A lot of innovation at media companies in Europe, especially the larger ones, happen with subsidies. And this is one of the projects that we're working on as well. So the goal of this innovation project is to work on technologies that can help with short-form content creation. So taking, for example, existing articles, say you write a news article, publish it to your news website, but then you also want to distribute it to other channels, social media channels that have a different type of style or requirements that you might need to follow. And so this project and the part that I'm also working on is especially focused on using LLMs, using these new technologies to help content creators, journalists, to translate their existing content, the things that they've written, put in the effort into, and then put it onto other platforms like TikTok, Instagram, etc.
So rather than using LLM to create new content, you use them to repurpose the content that's already been created, right? So, and what are the major challenges that you are facing doing this? Especially because since you also involved like TikTok, for example, there's not just written content, but also video and audio content. So it's a complex scenario there. So what are the challenges?
Definitely. I mean, on a technical level, there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of challenges at the stakeholder level and the implementation level, especially of getting such a application actually used in real production processes, because there are a lot of potential risks that needs to be mapped and need to be accounted for in an actual use. So maybe I could start off with addressing what you've mentioned, TikTok. Like, what are the challenges translating to a different platform? So the focus today is largely on translating text content. So if you have an article with a video, for example, on the news website, the focus is not on translating that video content as well, for example, making it more like into a TikTok style video with short snapshots or whatever, but mostly on taking the text content and then putting it into a nice hook that you could use to make people look at your TikTok, to make them interested, to keep them engaged. But, and here's the but, what you're describing is also part of the scope of the larger project and something that we may also pick up in the near future. And there are already steps being taken in that direction to also take existing video footage and then cut it up in a certain way for different platforms in a completely autonomous way. But this is something that is definitely, would be earliest 2024.
Well, it's not so far anyway. Yeah. But like, so now, right now, you're just transforming the text into video form, like, for example, in Instagram and TikTok. So, for example, like the stories, quote unquote. How do you do that? Like, because some people would use Midjourney or something like that to extract clips. Would you just let someone speak and grab images, or... Yeah, it's just hard for me to imagine how someone would actually see this stuff.
So I completely understand that. So to clarify, right now, the focus is really on the text domain. So that means a person takes an existing article, puts it into our application, which we call the Smart News Assistant, because the focus today is on news content. And then from there onwards, you would get generation of summaries or specific headlines, components that you would need for social media platforms, such as the description, the different parts of the text that would appear actually in the video, etc., etc. But it's not so much a translation already towards, here's a video right now. That's really for the future.
Yeah.
So by the kind of applications you described, it's like repurposing, summarizing, and so I think you should have pretty good results with your project, because the technology should be mature as long as it's a supervised system. Or are you aiming more at a completely independent system that does everything by its own?
Question. So at this point in time, it's still in a prototype phase where we have users already testing it out, but before it gets integrated into production processes, it still needs to be cleared out whether we're going to be the extent of automation that we want to strive for. In my view, the future looks like summarization happening before you ever start to work on this article, trying to convert this article from the news platform to social media platform. So there's already a pre-populated field that has a proposal for a summary, for a title, etc., ready to go. That's one workflow. The other workflow is an interactive process where a user, a human in the loop, really starts to interact with something like what people are familiar with, ChatGPT, and see this pre-computed summary, which maybe doesn't fully capture all of the elements that the content creator might like. And so starts a conversation with ChatGPT or whatever you call it, smart news assistant, and interactively improves this summary to fit what they're trying to accomplish. So these are sort of the two workflows that we see. But in any case, there needs to be editorial control, right? Because it's not possible for us to just take an existing article and then push it onto TikTok without any human in the loop there. I'm definitely not the person who's setting the policy for editorial control, but I don't see a world where this is going to happen. And actually, I think the Swedish radio recently published a policy paper exactly on that, stating, look, we still have responsibility for the content that we put out. So in the end, there needs to be some level of human supervision.
I believe personally that it's not going to take long before we see completely automated smart assistants out there. But I think the real issue is not about how mature the technology is. Right now, not completely, but it will be, I think, soon enough. The problem is that, and there is the opportunity that this kind of assistance can be used not just in news, but in a variety of information or media setting, even within companies for internal communications or to share documentation and so on. There are a lot of applications. But I think what is hard to grasp for most of the public is that there is no exact answer, no single exact answer to the task of summarizing. Because sometimes there's this idea that, there's this text that is ideally would be, 5 lines, and then it has been like just inflated with useless information that made it turn into a 30 pages paper. But the reality is that usually there's a lot more information, and when you want to shrink it that much, you need to cut some useful information. So the real question is, how do we manage this choice of the information to keep and to remove? And I think that's where the human in the loop will never be removed, in terms of that we need to explain exactly what we want at the very least, and not have this magic idea of, it does everything by its own and magically understand what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, indeed. It's not that LLMs are magic. There's no. I mean, they kind of seem like magic if you would go back 2 years ago in the field of AI, you would almost consider them magic because of how much of a leap they are, obviously. But indeed, there's a lot to be said about human preference. So a lot of the magic that makes LLMs like ChatGPT just work or do what we want is this process of reinforcement learning with human feedback, this process of tuning the model to give answers that we want to see. But it's very much biased towards the type of people that give that feedback, right? And so there's indeed no one right answer. How do you summarize a news article? It's a very personal question, because people like to consume content in different ways, like varying levels of detail. And then there's, of course, the question of what is truth, or in politics, it becomes especially contentious to maybe make the right do the correct inference from a larger article that contains all the nuances towards a sensible summary that does not take any position. So yeah, definitely challenging. I agree with you.
Yeah, I can imagine like some journalists feeling like left out. I don't know if it happened to you, but like I can picture some journalists who are not so comfortable in using this, and then there are other journalists who are very comfortable in using AI and say this makes their life easier because they are not used to sharing stuff in social media. But yeah, like how was the feedback of these journalists when you introduced this AI tool?
Yep. Very good point. So it's an ongoing process of how we're going to actually implement it in production. So in an actual workflow with a 24/7 news cycle where you need to be fast, there's no room for failure, or at least very little failure. News doesn't wait. It needs to be there very quickly. So if you use a tool like this, it needs to work, and there needs to be very clear guidelines on what is allowed, what is not allowed. And so it's not just me working on this project. It's a fantastic team at innovation, also a lot of user researchers that help us to conduct workshops with journalists to understand where their problems lie today, where they see potentials for AI to contribute or to even take away tasks that they don't like doing, and also to understand what are the potential risks or the obstacles, both at the level of user adoption, but in actual operationalization, where you have this in a very challenging environment where things need to happen every day on time. And from what I've seen, the journalists seem very motivated and engaged actually to start using this technology. They see actually mostly a boon in it. They don't see it as a threat, if I may take a position there. I'm certain there are people there that might consider it a bit of a threat, but it's clear that at this point, LLMs are not going to be taking over the role of journalists fully, but they're going to be there so that journalists can do more and focus more on, for example, investigative journalism or the parts of the job that make whatever they create the most fun or the most engaging, the most qualitative, and that reinforce the brand. So I imagine there are companies, maybe companies that are new to the news sphere or news ecosystem, that don't care so much about authenticity or about their personal brand. And of course, then you can take shortcuts. You may not care as much about pushing out content that may not be fully nuanced or truthful. But the company I work at, it's definitely very important to have this level of authenticity and trust and quality in the work that they do. And so the focus for journalists, from the ones I've talked to at least, is really on taking away tasks off their plate that are not fun. Like, for example, generating a title. Generating a title could take a long time. It sounds really ridiculous, but it's really hard to create a good title. And just being able to generate 10 titles with certain criteria can already take 10, 20, 30 minutes out of their day, which can be a lot.
Yeah. But do you think, I don't know, but do you think like, that all these news channels would get like a certain, like a common source, like Reuters or something for the most general news?
You mean the press agency?
Yeah, the press agency. So like the AP, Associated Press. So do you think this would reduce the amount of copy-paste tendency among news channels? Because that's what we're seeing everywhere around the world. Like they're almost saying the same thing, but just tweaking it a bit and making it sound different. But it's still the same thing.
It's a very good question. It's also a question I've posed as well. It's sort of it's it's a multifaceted question and answer here. So it's also a challenge that I'm continuously bringing to the stakeholders of this company, especially the decision makers, in what makes us unique as content creators, as media creators, as news broadcasters. What is it that makes the brand special? Is it just the brand itself, like people trust it, its authenticity? Is it a certain style in which we write? Is it the process in creating articles? Maybe it's just copying things from Reuters. I don't think so, but let's say it's that could be then maybe not part of the competitive advantage or the unique proposition of this company. And yeah, nothing's stopping certain companies from adopting the writing style or the way of publishing of another news company in a couple of days, in principle, using LLMs. You can copy it very quickly. And so I think the focus I hope the focus is shifting towards emphasizing on capitalizing upon those things that make a news organization, a media organization unique. And usually, at least from my perspective, that would be in the process of creativity and trust. So for news, that could be the aspects of investigative journalism. How do you put more time into that? How do you highlight that? How do you turn it into an asset instead of maybe just the writing style or just copying things from Reuters?
I think sooner or later, the social media, which are one of them, or maybe the most like widespread media agency nowadays, will shift from privileging, from favoring the amount of content to favoring content which is different, because exactly of LLMs technology, which are amplifying by 10 or 100 factor the amount of content that it's produced. And everybody sells, not everybody, but many companies sell the idea of just use an LLM and you want your productivity will become 10 times bigger. You will just not do any more tasks. You will just be there and read the title, and the LLM will do everything. And there are actually media like channels or pages or content creators which actually use these technologies a lot, especially in the marketing field, in the content marketing field. And so I think at some point the social media will have to use some kind of anomaly detection to favor like anomalous content, which is also more interesting. And I think this will be a major challenge for all of these LLM systems, because they're not designed to create original content. They are designed to create average content by definition, let's say. So what do you think of that? Do you think the industry is taking this as this side of the story into consideration and kind of preparing for it? Or do you think we're still in the falling in love phase where we think we're going to get all the advantages and none of the drawbacks?
No such thing. I don't think that's going to happen now. Maybe just to address the first part of what you mentioned, namely the social media components, that they might start to favor content that is different. So I think there's a popular term that at least in like tech spheres is used to describe this, which is like the signal to noise ratio of content. So where you want to maybe put out content that is highly distinguished or more distinct from other content, adding new types of information or bringing a new lens to an existing problem or a new problem. And so I guess your claim would be, look, in the future, social media platforms might just start to favor more content that is really distinct or unique. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah. Yes. That's my claim, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, there's some interesting things happening in the ecosystem of news, content creation in general as well, but especially in news. Google used to have a partnership with a lot of different news organizations, large news consortia, but Google actually started to cut their news partnership team, I think this year or the previous year. And the relationship between news organizations and social media platforms, the large verticals like Google, Meta, etc., seem to be becoming worse and worse. From what I've gathered, it's definitely not a complete view, but this is what I've understood. And so the question is a little bit more, who needs who? In this equation, does Google or does Meta need news organizations? Because I'm not saying that this is a good thing, by the way, but the problem is a little bit that they're sort of the main distributors. People find a lot of their news through social media. And so they have a lot of power there. And they might not really need news content creators anymore. I think just last month or a couple of months ago, there was a case in Germany where consortia of news organizations was litigating Google, I believe, for their use of content without proper attribution or without proper, let's say, remuneration, and claimed to have damages somewhere along the lines of a couple of hundreds of millions of euros. And the judge actually decided more so in the favor, I would say, of Google, as they had to pay only about 4 million euros for the news articles to access to the content of this many news organizations in Germany, which is actually a huge blow, I think, to the industry, meaning that they're basically not valued according to the, let's say, facts and numbers or whatever reasoning that judge in Germany has followed. And there are some big implications, I think, for news and content creation organizations in the future, where a lot of the social platforms hold the reins, hold the power in their hands. So that's one very dystopian aspect of answering your question. But there's a couple of others, but I'll let you.
Another dystopian idea I had in mind of what you said, anomaly, right? Which gave an alarm in my head, like ding, 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 conspiracies. Like conspiracies are like anomalies too, and people like it. So I wanted to know how the AI tool for these for the journalists work, because maybe I don't know, what I was thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, you could train this AI tool to write on a certain way based on the information that's circulating in the internet.
I think the question is, how do you fine-tune the LLM to satisfy the needs of this specific broadcaster, versus the out-of-the-box solution?
Okay, all right. Yeah, this is it's an interesting question, and it starts a lot with managing prompts. So, as you probably know, LLMs, they have this capability of zero-shot learning or few-shot learning, which means that in essence, you can give it a prompt, some instruction, and it will figure out what you want without having to retrain it. So for example, if you say, I want the summary to have 3 bullet points, it needs to be approximately this many words per bullet point, and the bullet point style or the text style should be very serious, very formal. Those are all things an LLM will typically be able to do. But there's still a lot of nuances, requirements in how people write or how a media company might like to position itself in its style that are not necessarily easy to get working out of the box. And that's definitely true. So actually an ongoing process is defining a style guide for different platforms and for different topics. So defining the rules that people might implicitly use in this company, but don't necessarily have written out yet. And if you just pass that style guide, in principle, the LLM should be able to start and use that to write very similar to the style that you envision. In practice, however, what we've seen is that ChatGPT, so GPT 3.5, the newer versions like GPT-4, they're trained on a very, very large part of the internet, including these news websites. So in a large part, they already have that style somewhat figured out. So if you just mention the company name, it already does a decent job, not a perfect job, but a decent job at mimicking it. And then the technical challenges actually start to rise when you have a large differentiation in terms of types of articles, types of platforms, styles. Maybe you want to still stay within the style of a certain writer that is very well known, or you want to do a certain type of column. Managing this can quickly explode. And this takes you down into something that is very specific to LLMs and bringing them into production, managing them in production. And that's prompt governance or prompt management. So if you have all of these different style guide requirements, you have all of these different tidbits of information that make the LLM write slightly different for the context that it wants to be used in, then you need to manage that in some way. And that can introduce a lot of complexity.
Do you think that could be one of the key difference between your tool and ChatGPT?
That is actually the difference, right? Because in a way, there's this very popular discussion topic on the internet about how many companies at this point are thin wrappers around the ChatGPT API. So a lot of companies that are building their entire value proposition upon just having some specific type of prompt and some little bit of engineering to then create a product that does X, Y, or Z for a very specific niche purpose, right? I don't want to necessarily go in that debate, but it's not so different from what we're doing. We're just reducing the amount of complexity or time it takes for an individual user to figure out how to tune the prompts in a certain way so that the LLM will do what they want. And sometimes that's very simple things, like I mentioned, the amount of bullet points. But other times it can be a lot of different requirements or pieces of text that a person would have to manipulate in a certain way. And the problem with LLMs is that it's definitely not robust in behavior. So if you, for example, would first say, okay, this is the task description, you have to summarize this article, and then you say, okay, this is the company, this is the context that you're operating in, and here is the style guide, then you might get a good result one time. And then if you switch the order, for example, you first say, okay, this is the company working, here is the requirements, and here's the task, you might get a very bad output. So this sort of tuning, the order of arguments, the order of information, the way that you structure information plays a very big role in how well it will actually work. And so that's part of what we do. And slapping an interface on top of that to make it easy for end users so they can use it in a way that actually gives them time better than takes time away, which is what a lot of end users seem to experience now if they have to use ChatGPT out of the box.
So you don't see any need in your use case to fine-tune the LLM itself?
So, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think when you're starting out in the prototyping phase, it's not needed to fine-tune necessarily. In many cases, you won't need to fine-tune if you're just trying to if you're trying to create this proof of value. But if you're going to a context where you want to reach the best quality, or you have an extremely niche scenario with data that was definitely not in the corpus of ChatGPT, then yes, you need to fine tune. I think it's like a value add rather than a necessity in many cases.
I think it's also, I agree with you, and I think it's also probably a useful step towards the engineering of the system, also for cost saving, because sometimes, yes, you can achieve the same result with prompt engineering, but if you add every time 2,000 tokens in front of your simple request, and you use that service a lot, in the end, it's going to be expensive. So sometimes it might be useful to fine tune so that it already behaves as you want, and just use 50 tokens to explain what you need and then get the answer. So I think it's also sometimes it might not be needed to reach the same accuracy, but it might be a useful step to make it convenient at scale, I think. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your analysis there. I think initially it often doesn't make sense to start with fine-tuning simply because if you don't know whether this is going to lead anywhere, you don't know if it's worth the price of actually fine-tuning and maintaining a fine-tuned model. And I'm talking here about something like the OpenAI API, not necessarily about even maintaining your own model, which is another step. But I'm really talking about models like GPT-4 here. And yeah, scale is one of the key factors in determining whether you need to go for a fine-tuning scenario as well. But I do think that in many cases, you won't end up needing it for a lot of use cases. When we're talking enterprise scale engagement, yes, then probably you need it to reduce the costs, yes.
Maybe one last technical question for me. I would like to hear your opinion on where the open source models are at this point in time. Do you think they can already be a replacement, still with cost saving in mind, like the Llama model, for example, which for some languages like English performs decently, or you think they're not at the point of being a valid replacement?
So my understanding is that 90% of people currently using LLMs in corporations are using OpenAI. The simple reason for that is that it's so much more convenient to have an API and not have to manage LLMs yourself, because it's a costly endeavor. There's a lot of different challenges in managing LLMs in production, and the solution space, the ecosystem, is not mature. It's not clear what are the best practices for LLMs at this point in time. That being said, there's definitely a case for open source LLMs in practice. One example is compliance, areas where you need to think about data privacy, about regulations. You don't want to share your data with any cloud provider. You don't want to share it with OpenAI or their enterprise offering in Azure OpenAI, where you have some level of safety built in or assurance that the data will not be saved or used in different ways. And that's where you may not have a choice, right, to go for something that is managed by another party. There's also the scenario where you're thinking about very large use cases or very task-specific use cases. So summarization is a good example of that, actually. You probably don't need a state-of-the-art LLM to do summarization. In fact, some of the latest models like Llama 2 or Mistral, a new mover in the European space, seem to be very good at summarizing. And if you manage these models yourself, maybe fine-tune them a little bit, and you have a sufficient number of requests, so you have a large enough user base, the cost advantage will definitely be there. On top of the advantage that you can also really fine-tune it and understand what's happening to the model. But in many cases, the cost of operations, of putting this into production, maintaining it, solving all of the issues, is just not worth it at this point in time.
Yeah, especially if you're a business, I think.
Yeah.
From a capability perspective, I think open source LLMs are definitely getting there and are even outperforming, let's say, GPT 3.5. I think they're just approaching the level of performance of GPT-4 in some domains, although I don't think, as far as I know, that there is any model out there currently that can outperform GPT-4 in so many different domains. But this is more of a capability perspective rather than what businesses actually use as considerations.
And I think what makes LLM so attractive right now, because I've also read your white paper, which is really nice, and I think people should read it if they want to learn more about adapting LLM into their business, is the usability. What made like the popularity of these LLMs rise in the past year is that it makes it easy for people to use it. Like, you broke down the barriers where engineers are the only ones who are capable of using AI, and now people who are not technical can use it as well. So they're now thinking it's a new toy. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. I think the barrier is now definitely lower thanks to API. But in my opinion, I think that there is an abuse of APIs. And sometimes, I don't know, I think sometimes software engineers don't like to meddle with hardware. And that's a real reason why we like APIs so much. Because in the end, you just need, like with, for example, Llama 2, the biggest model, which is 70 billion parameters, you just need a single, like, 6,000 ADA, like, Quadro GPU for, like, with quantization to deploy the model. And if it's not a critical, like, application, like if you don't need, like, 99.99% uptime, you don't need AWS servers or Azure or cloud. You just have your own workstation somewhere. And yes, maybe once in 3 years it will go down, but it's not a big issue if you're not, if it's not a critical application. So, and I mean, so you could have like your personal hardware to run an LLM for something less than 10,000 euros forever. And it's like, it's just that I think we are too used to use APIs always. I'm not saying, of course, if you're prototyping, it doesn't make sense to use this kind of technology. And if you just have a few requests once in a while, it doesn't make sense again. But if you have like thousands of requests every day, I think it's a reasonable alternative. And there are also alternatives that just use CPUs, for example. For example, there's Neural Magic, which is a company that it's writing code and libraries to execute this kind of LLMs on just CPUs, which is much cheaper from a point of view, and you don't have any memory constraints. So we're going to be technical, but the point is that there are alternatives. It's just that I think using the API sometimes it's just easier. It's not more convenient. Of course, there is a point where it's also more convenient, but I think we tend to use the APIs far beyond the point where they're not convenient anymore, just because it's easier. And I think this is also harming our environment in a way because of how much energy they use, like using. So I think it's like that. There's a lot there to be said. It's like APIs, as you said, it's very easy, it's very fast to use, and it's. But again, hardware is not so bad, and I think we should go back to understand hardware better because it's not that complicated, in my opinion.
No, I don't disagree with that latter point. I have to be honest, I don't completely understand what you, like the distinction between easy and convenient for you. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I'm saying easy is from the point of view of deploying and maintaining that kind of system. Convenient, it's from an economic point of view. So it might be convenient if you look at the balance sheet, like, okay, this is how much it's going to take us to develop and deploy the system locally, and this is how much it would cost us running versus how much it is to just run it with the API. That's convenient. But easy is another thing. Easy is like, okay, do I really want to bother with thinking about how to handle my own hardware? I have to choose it, I have to maintain it. Do I really want to do it? And I think sometimes it's just, you can call it laziness in a way, because like it's just easier to use only the APIs, you know? This is what I feel in my experience. Okay, I'm not saying you do, but in my experience, I've seen it a lot. A lot of let's just use AWS because it's so cool.
Just to challenge you on this, isn't it there like a saying, a good engineer, a lazy engineer is a good engineer? Like taking the keep it simple is one of these principles. No, I mean I understand what you're saying. I think I mean, if you're in a company that has few resources or not so many, like let's say a dedicated AI team, I don't think there's any reason why you would go for hardware, because it's extra complexity that you probably don't have the human resources to manage, let alone the potential risks that are associated with that. So I don't think it's necessarily interested, but when you reach a certain scale, yes, and scale doesn't necessarily mean in terms of company size, but just the number of users that you're interacting with, that you expect this LLM model to do some type of inference for, then yeah, absolutely, you need to start thinking about, should I move away from the cloud, because it's way more expensive, obviously, in the long term. I think if you're talking about millions of users, it can be like 1/3 of your cost if you start maintaining it yourself. But still, there's a lot of risks and a lot of considerations, a lot of optimizations at this point that are really difficult to keep up with if you're not a hardware expert and be somewhat also involved with managing a data center / cluster. And then even more specific here is that we're in the context of a GPU inference cluster. And even more specific or challenging is the whole LLM solution space and the ongoing optimizations on that level. That being said, I think as practitioners, you're completely on the money that it should be good practice. It would be a good idea for us to start to understand more the systems level programming, starting to understand the considerations on the hardware level. And I think some of the interesting movements in this space are Mojo, for example, if you've heard of it. No? Okay. So Mojo is this new type of framework, a sort of superset of Python, which aims to use the Python community as one of the largest AI communities and the accessibility of the language of Python, but supplement it with the ability to really do neural, let's say AI system building without having a disconnection in the language itself. So what do I mean by that? If today I want to build a new architecture, a new type of model, for example, in LLMs, they use transformers. Recently, there was the addition of flash attention, a new type of mechanism to be more efficient, so it could save a lot of money for companies. Somebody comes up with it in the academic community thinking, hey, we can optimize this. And somebody implements it into CUDA, which is this framework for writing, let's say, more low-level GPU software. Then that integration needs to happen between CUDA and one of the popular machine learning frameworks like PyTorch or TensorFlow. And only then will a practitioner, after learning a bit of PyTorch and TensorFlow, actually be able to use it, let alone, well, they won't understand it probably, but they will be able to use it with an API. And so Mojo is a language that is trying to remove that disconnect and sort of unite, give the power back to people that know Python and enter slowly into systems level programming and be able to take advantage of the optimizations there and remove that sort of long loop. So as practitioners, I'm definitely on board. As a business, depends.
Yeah, because I think, as you said in the white paper, people need to understand their goal. If they're not even clear with their goal on what to use or how to use the LLM, what's the point?
Yes. And yeah, that's true. And so it's not bad. And I think on this last point, I think we also have to be careful in abstracting too much, because I think there's the risk of losing grasp on what's happening underneath. So it's something that is also applicable for the end users of LLMs. It's like, yes, if you use an LLM to do the groundwork for journalists, then the common objection is, how do you train new journalists?
So like
Because
the
they've been
transparency or the explainability?
No, it's just that this dull groundwork that nobody wants to do is usually the way juniors are trained. So one of the big issues is that the extensive usage of LLMs is going to make it harder for juniors to find an internship or like an entry-level position, because instead, in a newspaper, instead of needing, 50 interns, you will need maybe 2, and you will just look for senior journalists, which right now is all good and nice, but 20 years down the line, you'll start lacking seniors because you didn't train them. So
yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the issues also with, for programmers, for software engineers, where now you have LLMs that can write dull code for you. And so you don't even need to look it up in Stack Overflow. You just ask ChatGPT for many questions. So, yeah, for us who became senior software engineer without ChatGPT, it's nice and good. But if you start like that, then your foundations are very weak because you don't really know how it works down there. So like I started writing neural networks like in NumPy and writing the backpropagation myself. So there was no TensorFlow, there was no Keras, right? And I even used CUDA, like from C++ at the time. It was computer vision, right? And so now it's so really nice to use so then TensorFlow and PyTorch came, which are like one level above. Then Keras, for example, came, and then there are other libraries which build on top of them, and everything is nice. But the new engineers who come now, they just start using the latest tools. So they have no idea how backpropagation is, which is how those models are trained works sometimes. Especially if they didn't go through a university course, but they're like self-taught with 6 months Coursera or another platform. So I think that's, this is maybe out of topic, but it is a serious consideration that we'll need to deal with in the next years, like how to use these tools without making these tools make us more stupid, let's say. So that's like, that is going to be a challenge, I think, in the next future, I think.
Near future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think LLMs really offer the opportunity to democratize education and knowledge in very meaningful ways. I think that's also why you have all these edtech companies jumping on it. I think even companies like Duolingo are collaborating with OpenAI to see how they can use it to advantage. In fact, I also tend to use ChatGPT to learn new things in fields that I have very little domain knowledge of, where maybe the barrier starts with the type of language that is used, right? Mathematics is a great example of that. Machine learning is a great example of that. And using tools like ChatGPT can be really meaningful. But indeed, the flip side is, how do we manage skill? How do you say it? Even skill.
Skill building.
Yes, like the fact that skills are going to be very AI centric, or I don't have an answer to this. Sorry, it's a difficult problem.
No,
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
But it is a risk that people don't see. So it's nice to bring it up too.
Yeah, my personal solution is not using it all the time. You know, like
That's very hard.
for example, of course, I use GitHub Copilot in my everyday coding. It's integrated in my IDE, and me personally, like sometimes let's say 1 in 4 or 5 times, I just write it myself, even if that's correct. You know, just to keep the memory fresh. I think that's the best I've found so far, but it's not a great answer.
Another mindset that I think people should consider is that even though ChatGPT and all these other LLMs resemble a human when they respond, it just looks like it's responding like a human just because of the user interface. But the way they arrive with that answer is not the same way as we arrive with an answer, because we have to go through the hoops to know the foundations very well to come up with the answer. So if we're just randomly guessing, like what ChatGPT and the rest are doing because of statistics, then we are screwed.
I think the big unspoken big theme here is going to be critical thinking, because it's so easy to just accept the answer when you don't have to think about how to get it. That's the truth, I think. What do you think, Tim?
Again, I have a lot of thoughts about this topic. I mean, I use ChatGPT to do systems level thinking, right? It's helpful as a sparring partner to check my assumptions. For example, in designing a new software system, can be really helpful to sort of have it second guess you, or even come up with alternative drafts, things that you would never think of. It's also quite good at translating, right? It's really good at translating anything from one like type of syntax to another, and also to help you with boilerplate code for sure. But anything in between, I agree, it's not something that you can trust ChatGPT with, and that's probably where a lot of technical debt is being built today. But more generally, God, it's a very challenging topic, and I'm not sure how it's going to evolve, frankly. But in contrast to, I think what you, I believe, so far from what I've understood, what you think, I think it's going to become more and more part of our daily life and our way of interacting with everything digital. I don't know if you've seen it, but Meta is going full steam ahead with trying to find a form factor for LLMs. They're going to put LLMs into their glasses, their smart glasses, so where you have this constant assistant in your glasses to interact with you. So I just see it as, like, I see LLMs getting into every product and also becoming more and more part of our life. It's really becoming digital glue for everything that was already in the digital domain. It's just being put in there and curating, searching everything for you. Whether that's good or not, that's something else.
It's like a gum that's stuck in your shoe.
No, I wouldn't say that. No, I wouldn't say that. It's just, I agree with Tim. And I really agree with you, Tim. And I think it's a tool, of course. It's not bad or good by itself. And it's up to us to, I think, remember that we need to use it to make ourselves more productive, more efficient, more powerful as human beings, and not more lazy.
Yeah.
Which is the real, I think, risk behind the door, because like I also use it as you do, but I mean, it's easy to just be lazy. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think
going back.
yeah. So
Going back.
yeah.
I think what we can learn from this use case is that LLM can be useful in content creation, but then you have to set some guardrails or a set of prompt like rules. Rules, right? Like a set of rules that the users could use, because LLMs are not really that stable as of the moment, or not really like, very established in giving you the hard truth of things, even though Elon Musk said it.
Yes,
His latest.
I think that's one of the point, and the other one, which I think it's coming out of the discussion we had, that sounded off topic, but it's not really, is that companies should really adopt these tools because they're really useful. Like in the broadcast agency that Tim is working for, but in so many other areas. But they should never forget that they need to look also long term, and remember that they need to do continuous education and to keep training juniors, because otherwise they will have a problem down the line. So yeah, it's a real asset now, but they should never forget, I think, in my opinion, to just look down the road and think, oh, we need to be also ready for when we'll be there. So I think...
Yeah, I agree with you. And it ties also into the problem of what we talked about before, the signal to noise ratio, about curation and distillation. So how do you curate information in a world that is becoming increasingly overflowing with information that is either irrelevant, wrong, or harmful, and then distilling that into a version that is possible to be processed by a human in a single lifetime, preferably in a single sitting, and also useful to learn from and to understand for an individual. And that's again where I think LLMs can be for very good forces, but also extremely bad, obviously. And today that's probably more leaning towards the bad, at least in terms of how it's affecting how people learn and interact with information in general. But I think it's something we're still figuring out.
Yeah. So we can get back to this in the future.
Yeah. We'll meet again in a few years, and let's see if it got better or worse.
We will be talking with our Meta glasses, and the glasses will tell me exactly what to tell to you in the moment to sound the smartest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Exactly. You will be sleeping in a while.
Exactly. Yes. Ultimate laziness. I think laziness is not bad. I don't think it's bad, but I think it shouldn't be at the cost of quality or ethics or whatever. But I think it's okay to have a little bit less time spent on work and a little bit more time spent on the things that are the most important in life, whichever you may find that to be. And that's what I hope LLMs are leading us to. That's the future I would like to go to. I don't know if that's the future we're currently heading towards. Probably.
We'll see.
Let's hope. We'll go there. Let's not forget to have a bit of brain maintenance from time to time while we rest on the beach.
So, you have any other questions?
I think we exhausted the argument topics for now. And do you want to go with our last
question? So my last question for Tim is, what book would you recommend to our listeners?
Wow. Okay.
You can ask your system now.
Let me go ahead and pause for a moment when I go to my ChatGPT assistant. Honestly, most of what I read these days is articles. So blogs, newsletters, as I'm trying to keep up with the constant stream of information, trying to distill it in some way, right? And papers. So I haven't read as many books as I would like in the last few years. I think a book that always comes back to me once in a while is Meditations, but it's very non-technical. It's a book by Marcus Aurelius about philosophy, about Stoicism, that is very helpful in a very tumultuous world. It's something I can definitely recommend reading, but maybe something more oriented towards people in the let's say, AI or technology domain, I would recommend reading Benedict Evans, a very interesting guy who does a lot of musings on strategy and comes up with some interesting theories about the future. I'm not sure if that's...
I really like the meditations of Marcus.
All right.
The suggestion. That's also one of our favorite books here. So it's like, it's a great choice.
It's one of those books.
Yeah, because it keeps you grounded.
Exactly. I think it's not good to lean into it too much, but it's one of those books that you put aside on your bedside table and you read it every couple of years, just to be reminded of normalcy in a way.
Yeah. So thank you, Tim, for this interesting conversation. I know we sidetracked a bit, but I think we've covered like all the different aspects of LLM, also discussing a bit about the use case on news production and content creation.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did.
Yeah, absolutely. You asked great questions, and I hope I gave decent answers.
Yeah,
great answers.
For sure. So to anyone who's interested to learn more about Tim Leers, dataroots, and their latest white paper on how you can adapt LLM into your business, check out the show notes. Then, if you want to continue listening to more episodes, hit the subscribe button. That's it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Till next time.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Gabriel.